Hey, this is Ed Robertson, and this is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast, where I introduce you to some of the innovative and creative individuals who are shaping the future of the American West. I meet most of these people through my work in ranch brokerage and land conservation, or through my hobbies and interests that revolve around spending time up high in the mountains. My guests include ranchers, writers, entrepreneurs, conservationists, athletes, artists, adventurers, pretty much anyone who's doing important work and has an interesting story to tell. My guest today is Chris Eyer. Chris is a true Western polymath. He's probably best known for his work as a mule packer, in which he uses mules to transport supplies into some of Montana's most remote wilderness areas. He documents these adventures on his extremely popular Instagram account called Mule Dragger. But as you'll hear in our conversation, mule packing only scratches the surface. Chris is an experienced mountaineer and climber, a former U.S. Marine, a practicing Buddhist, a leather craftsman, and a successful electrical contractor. From his home base in Montana's Bitterroot Valley, Chris leads a full and fascinating life, working hard and enjoying his connection to the natural world and to his animals. Chris was raised in California, and from an early age he was attracted to the outdoors and adventures in wild places. On a backpacking trip during his teens, he came across a team of mules and was immediately entranced. From that moment on, he knew he wanted to work as a mule packer. As an adult, Chris taught himself the ins and outs of mule packing, a hard-knocks method of learning the trade that he does not recommend to the faint of heart. But through this long and tough self-education, he established amazingly deep relationships with all of his animals, relationships that have significantly enriched his life in many ways. As you'd expect from someone with Chris's diverse set of experiences, we had an amazingly wide-ranging conversation. We chatted about how he became a mule packer and some of the crazy and scary experiences from early in his career. We discussed his time in the Marines and the lessons he learned that carry over into his current daily life. We also talk about his connection to Buddhism and his meditation practice and how this mindful approach to life and wilderness travel keep him and his team of animals safe in dangerous situations. Chris also explains the specifics of mules, both from a biological and temperamental perspective, and we discuss Chris's unique connection to the legendary alpinist Conrad Anker. As usual, we talk about books, films, Chris's favorite place in the West, and much more. There's a ton of amazing information in this episode, so be sure to check out the episode notes for the full list. Hopefully I'll get Chris back on for part 2 because there's still plenty to discuss. Hope you enjoy. When you meet somebody for the first time, never met them before, and they ask you, what do you do? How do you answer that?
Typically I think I just say, and I do get asked that question quite a bit just because of, the kind of work I do. And normally I just tell people, I just got a lot of irons in the fire, which seems to be the most accurate way to describe, my life, both work and pleasure and passion. It seems like, I just got a lot of different things going. I have this full-on electrical contracting company, running full bore with employees and all that in Missoula. And then have this packing business, which is its own separate, entity, which is running strong in the summer. And then, I have another company that makes I make saddles and tack, Heart W Saddlery. And so I have that going as another hustle. And then I own a couple rental properties, which I have that going. I do just I've been doing just a little bit of farrier work on the side, but mostly I just stick with my own stock. So those are kind of the main things I got going at the moment anyway.
Yeah. Well, do you ever sleep? Are you able to work sleep in there at all?
Sleep's overrated, man.
Well, man, we got a lot to talk about then with all that. So where are you right now? Where am I catching you right now?
So right now I'm just at home in my office here in Stevensville, Montana, in the Bitterroot Valley.
So can you describe the Bitterroot Valley a little bit? Because out of all the places I've been all over the West, that is one of my favorites. I mean, it's just spectacular. Can you just talk a little bit about that area?
Yeah, it's a beautiful area, for sure. It's kind of a big, wide valley that runs north, south, and on the west side of the valley, there's the Bitterroot Mountain Range, which is like a glaciated mountain range. So you have all these glaciers that sort of poured down, creating all these valleys. And each one of those has its own trailhead for the most part. Almost all of them have their own trailhead and their own, trail that goes back up and then branches off and ties into the whole Bitterroot Selway wilderness complex. And then on the east side, you have the Sapphire Mountains, which are quite a bit lower. And I live on the east side of the valley. And, so I have this great view of all those mountains that are to the west of me. But yeah, it's a really neat old valley. And, it was one of the first white settlements. It was where, there was the Salish Indians lived, just down the road from me. And so there's a pretty rich Native American history here. And, the first white settlement in this state was here. And, later it ended up getting developed. The valley ended up getting developed by Marcus Daly. And, he had a whole sort of land plan on how to get people to live here. And he sort of sold it as a great place to grow apples, which there's still quite a few apple orchards around that are left over from that time period. So that's sort of, the history of it in brief.
Yeah, it's a cool place. I used to do some work in that area, and I remember looking at some ranches around there, and there was a lot of talk about how they used to be apple orchards back in the day, and I can't even remember, but the price per acre, this was early 1900s, I guess, and it was equal to what it was now because there was such a boom there. It was the craziest thing to learn about.
It really was, yeah.
So how did you end up there? Go ahead.
No. So I ended up here, in a way, this I guess a lot of my story is kind of in sort of like on a micro level, on a macro level. I think my own personal narrative, my own personal story really is about like a return to my roots in a way. Mm-hmm. And so, I'm not from the Bitterroot Valley. I'm not from Montana. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, in right near the ocean, a place called Palos Verdes, kind of nestled at the southern end of the South Bay. And, so, I don't know if you want me to just jump right into the story.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So basically, I grew up there, and, my family had a place also in Napa Valley, California. And, when I was a little kid is really when I had my first horse experience, which, one of my earliest memories, my childhood memories, is actually being set on top of a horse, by some neighbor friends of ours. And this wonderful woman named Betsy Shepherd. And she had a few kids, and she took a liking to myself. And she, I remember that day she picked me up and set me on her big old horse, Savato, who I still remember, this big sorrel gelding, and set me up there in that saddle. And I remember I just remember being so scared. It just felt so high up. And I remember she just was like whispered in my ear. She just said, he can tell you're scared. And if you try to not be scared, he's going to be more calm and more relaxed. And like, in a way, of course, I was 5 years old. That message never really sunk in, but at the same time, it was something that I just carried with me for so long, and still just a huge part of my experience today, which is just this feedback loop, this mirror that these equines give back to me. So they are looking and picking up on my emotional cues and on all my nonverbal communication. And they're so much better at it than we are, because it's a matter of life and death for them to read, body language. And so in a way that's sort of what got me started. And then, on the whole idea of what, it means to be involved in equines as a small kid. And then later, I didn't grow up with horses. My parents weren't into horses, but I had other friends and cousins that were into horses, and had a couple girlfriends in high school, and they had horses in the area where I grew up. And so, I rode, off and on, and I certainly would not describe myself as being in any way, shape, or form like a horse crazy kid.
Yeah.
Because I really wasn't. I always knew there was something about him that was special to me. But honestly, I was much more interested in getting out into the backcountry. I was in the Sierra Club as a kid, and I was at the time one of the youngest graduates ever of the basic mountaineering training school. And really, horses were amazing, but it always seemed like so much. It seemed there's so much infrastructure involved in them, and as opposed to hiking and doing trail work, which is really what I was, just loved. Rock climbing, getting out into the mountains. And, I always kind of imagined myself as, just kind of, ending up just as some sort of a dirtbag climber, mountaineer. That's kind of the direction I sort of, assumed I would go, in many different ways when I was in high school. And was certainly heavily influenced by the sort of mountaineers of that time. Especially, people like Conrad Anker and Alex Lowe in particular very much captured my imagination. And I loved their spirit. I loved their wilderness ethic. I loved how they were just so, they were so brave and so bold. And they just, they just really, I felt like both of them were really good at just wearing their hearts on their sleeve. They were just fearless with how they felt. And they had so much passion and so much drive to do the things, you know, that they did, that it just, I always thought, well, shoot, I'm going to end up like some lesser version of those two guys. And then later, as they developed as climbers and mountaineers, and I saw them starting to go into the Himalayas, and I saw the influence that Buddhism had on their lives, that also in turn had a big influence on my life as well. But that maybe is a sort of separate sideline to the story. But basically, I'm in the Sierras. Back when I was 15 and a half years old, I was in the Sierras, and I was doing a kind of a long-term hike with a group of people in the Sierra Club. And I was sort of, you know, probably about 4 or 5 miles out in front of everyone. It was the last day we were going to be in the wilderness. We'd just come out of Big Whitney Meadows, and we were headed over the pass into Horseshoe Meadow trailhead. And I remember I heard this strange sound, you know, on the trail coming up, and I just could not imagine what that was. And, you know, around the corner, there came this packer, and he was riding a horse, and I believe he was packing 5 mules behind him. And, you know, I just got off the trail, and I was just absolutely starstruck by the whole thing. I didn't even know that still happened. I didn't know that was still done. I'd certainly heard stories about it, but I just did not know that was still a thing that was actually happening. And I was just completely blown away by it. I remember the packer, he was completely silent, and we just he caught my eye, I caught his, and I just watched him go by. And I remember watching every mule behind him, you know, just looked me right in the eyes. And it was literally at that moment that I was like, yeah, one day I'm going to do that. You know, one day that's really what I'm going to be about. And then in a lot of ways, it's just been it's a long process to get from that moment when I was 15, you know, all the way up to where I am now. So, you know, after that, I ended up, you know, just finished high school. I joined the Marine Corps when I was 17 years old.
Did you really?
To do that. Yeah. So I served during the first Gulf War, and which was an amazing experience. You know, not something that, you know, not something I would necessarily recommend to everyone, but it was great for me. It was really good. I had come from kind of a broken family, broken home life, and in a lot of ways that situation, being a Marine, like, it just did so much for my confidence. It did so much for just showing me how to navigate life. So yeah, it was an amazing experience. It was a little bit harder once the war started. It was a little bit harder to imagine, you know, actually, you know, killing people. It became relatively clear to me early on in my tour of duty that, like, yeah, I was not super interested in that. Actually, I did not want to go out and, you know, shoot some other poor, you know, scared 19-year-old kid, you know, that was living in some other country. And, you know, I just saw like a different sort of underbelly to the way that, you know, the sort of military industrial complex works, and how that gets deployed around the world, and, you know, how these things get sold as humanitarian missions. And they're obviously significantly more layers to it than just that, typically economic. But with all that said, I don't have any regrets about it at all. It was definitely probably one of the better moves I ever made in my life, was actually becoming a Marine. But yeah, got out of the Marines and went to college at Marymount College, and you know, did not find college particularly challenging. I ended up taking a philosophy class, but it was the first time I'd ever gotten a B in anything in college. And it just made me so angry that I decided I was going to become a philosophy major. So
that's a common theme of people have on this podcast. Somebody tells them they can't do something, or somebody kind of doubts them, and then that's it. It's on.
And it was. So I was ready to go with that. And as a part of that, going to school there in Southern California, I was forced to take this religious studies course, and which was a great class taught by a Benedictine priest that had nothing to do with Catholicism. It just had to do with exploring other religious traditions, none of which I was particularly interested in. But when we were forced to go on a field trip to a Thai Buddhist temple in North Hollywood, I went there, and it was like I could see everything I saw in the Marines without the overall direction being, you know, like death and destruction. It was, you know, about compassion and interconnection. And it was like, there was the camaraderie, there was the sort of like singularity of purpose. There was like a monomaniacal sort of focus on, you know, growth and development. And I thought, man, that totally lit me up. And so with that in mind, I transferred to where I knew I'd always end up, which is at the University of Montana, because, my family's from here. My mom was born just down the road from where I live. And so there'd been a lot of times where we made so many treks back to Montana. And I grew up on a steady diet of listening to these stories of my grandfather telling me all these stories where he grew up, which was right at in the foothills of the Bob. And obviously it wasn't called the Bob Marshall Wilderness then, but he spent a lot of time in those mountains and in those hills and in those prairies around that area. So I always knew I'd end up back there. This is sort of a return back to my roots. And so, came to the University of Montana and, got tied in with a really, really amazing Buddhist studies professor there. And he'd sort of given up big league academics, and he let go of his career at both at Princeton and Stanford so that he could come to a small place like this and live where he wanted to live and teach Buddhist studies. And so anyway, he kind of took me under his wing, and he's someone who I'm still, really good friends with to this day. And he took me under his wing and exposed me to a lot of Western philosophy and a lot of Buddhist history and a lot of Buddhism in general. And so sort of in the meanwhile, this is all happening. I'm getting out in the wilderness as often as I can. I'm hiking all over the place, a lot of solo trips in the Anaconda Pentler Wilderness area, a lot of solo trips in the Bitterroots. Eventually I met a woman in one philosophy class, and she's like this horse crazy lady. And we connected up, and I bought my first horse. I think it was in 1995, and I bought this big old Belgian draft horse, and just told her hey, I want to go in the mountains. I want to figure out how to pack. This is what I want to do. She came from an English writing background. And so, initially, she got me started with that whole program of really learning horsemanship from more of a dressage and eventing sort of perspective, which it was definitely my foundation, taking lessons from people who truly knew how to ride those disciplines. But relatively quickly, I abandoned that and started riding Western, which is what I really wanted to do. But just started trekking through the hills with that one horse, and just had, just an absolute junk show going down the trail with all my stuff on my horse, and plowing into the mountains and not having any idea at all what I was doing with horses. So that woman, she knew, so much about horses and knew nothing about camping in the backcountry. I knew a lot about camping in the backcountry and travel and navigation and all that, but I really didn't know anything about equines with any depth. So, she definitely brought me along and exposed me to so many different aspects of, equines and what that's all about and how the communication works and how to read them and how to see what they're doing, and really opened my eyes to all that. I'll certainly forever be grateful to her for all that. So that's kind of what got me into it. I ended up marrying her. And then, we had kids, and I just kept going. And I still have some pictures floating around of me, taking that same draft horse completely overloaded. And I have a kid in a backpack, and I'm leading this horse into the backcountry. So I drug my kids all over the wilderness. And, eventually, as my career, I got out of college, I started a restaurant in Missoula with a friend and did that for a year. And then, figured out that it's pretty tough to stay in Montana and make a decent living. So, I got an electrical apprenticeship, and started doing electrical work, in Missoula. And when I was in the Marine Corps, my primary job skill was I was an avionics technician. So basically an electrician on airplanes.
Okay.
And so, I started doing electrical work in Missoula, and then, relatively soon went out, started my own business, and have been doing that ever since as the primary way to earn money. And that certainly has been a good ride for me. But along the way, what came with that was an ability to, purchase land and purchase stock and start getting into the backcountry more and more and more. And really eventually start giving back to these wilderness areas, that mean so much to me. Fully 80+% of the packing I do is on a strictly volunteer basis for different trail crew organizations. And I also just straight up volunteer for the federal government, moving hay and gear and equipment for them for no compensation whatsoever.
Man, just in that story there's probably 10 different things that I could talk to you for an hour about. You're talking about Alex Lowe, Conrad Anker, who I admire both. You're talking about the Marines. You're talking about Buddhism. All this stuff
Yep.
is unbelievably interesting. So, all right, I'm just going to kind of jump around for a minute if you don't mind. But so the Marines, you went to that. You know, that's the Marines has a reputation of being the most hardcore. You know, you cannot be out of shape in the Marines, whether you're the general or whether you just show up. So when you showed up in the Marines and went into the basic training, when you look back, the guy that went in and then the guy that came out of that, what was the biggest change you think you saw in yourself after going through that experience?
I would say, like, in the simplest way, probably two things. The first thing was actually just a deep sense of engagement with life. Like, I had the senior drill instructor who definitely had a huge influence on me, and his name's Staff Sergeant Knutson. I actually don't even know his first name, but just always addressed him as drill instructor, Staff Sergeant Knutson. And that guy had a massive influence on me, and he was such an intense guy, and he would always just hammer on these certain things, like, you know, if it's worth doing, it's worth doing it all the way. And so, you know, there were certainly a lot of smaller little lessons like that he instilled in me, but it was definitely like, you know, life is not a spectator sport. Like, you got to get in there and do it and go after it. And if it doesn't work out, trust me, you're going to find what you want or what you need to do along the way, but don't sit around. Don't wait for something to come to you. Go out and get what you want and take life by the horns and get after it. And so that certainly was a big piece of it. But then he also sprinkled in a number of other things that were incredibly counterintuitive that I think in a lot of ways took me, you know, years and years to unpack. And maybe in some ways I'm still trying to unpack them. But, you know, I remember like sitting in the squad bay at night, and it's kind of this quiet time, and, you know, where everyone's sort of going to bed. And, you know, when he was on duty for the night, he'd sort of walk up and down the racks, the beds, and he would just have these little funny little stories he'd tell and little life lessons. But, you know, he would say things like, you know, right before he left, he would say things like, "Hey, love is the only thing that matters." And then he'd walk out of the room, and I'd be like, wait, what? How does this fit into this? You know, this guy's been yelling at me all day, all of us. And like, I just was so counterintuitive. You know, I just couldn't, the juxtaposition of him talking about the centrality of love when it comes to life at the same time in this setting just sort of scrambled my head in so many ways, you know, but in a way that sort of has just continually come back to, like, you know, just trying to understand, well, what the hell does that even mean? And what does love even mean? What does that mean? What's it about? Why is this piece of connection so important? And why was it important to him? And not that I even, you know, in a way, I'm kind of quite happy to leave that as a relatively unresolved question and just continue to sort of mull it over, and just watch it sort of fan out into the world. So,
yeah. Well, it's like those,
yeah,
and it's kind of like those, are they called koans? Koans, Buddhist koans, that koans that are, you know, these questions that you ask, but there is no real answer.
Correct. Yeah. It is a lot like that for sure. Yep. Very much so.
So as far as Buddhism goes, would you consider yourself a practicing Buddhist now? Or do you have a serious meditation practice? How much of Buddhism is in your daily life?
Yeah, I would say actually, you know, there's this funny meeting between my equine world and Buddhism as a practice. Yeah, I would consider myself to be a Buddhist. I mean, to be a Buddhist really at the end of the day just means, in the simplest forms, just means that you go for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. You just go for refuge to the example of the Buddha, to the teachings that he put forth, and to the larger community of followers who are just trying to transform themselves into better, more compassionate, connected human beings. So sure, I would consider myself that. I later went on and got my master's degree in Buddhist studies from the University of Sunderland in the UK. So I'm fairly well grounded in it. And I probably started meditating in, I think it was 94, something like that. And then, and I've had a pretty darn consistent practice since then, both Vipassana and Shamatha. So the sort of like centering, grounding, and also an insight-based meditation practice, primarily for the last 12 years or something. It's pretty much been almost exclusively Vipassana meditations. But yeah, I got involved in setting up the Rocky Mountain Buddhist Center in Missoula, and I, did a bunch of stuff with that. And, then, I got pretty involved in teaching for quite a few years. I don't really do any of that anymore, but I did do quite a bit of teaching for a while and led a bunch of retreats and whatever, and had a great time doing all that, and, all interfaced with my master's degree. But, and I've certainly sat at the feet of some pretty remarkable humans and some pretty incredible Buddhist teachers. But, honestly, at the end of the day, trying to figure out what it means to practice and what does it mean to do this life, and ultimately it actually came down to being with my equines, because that actually is certainly the most transformative practice that I've ever been involved in, and it certainly has a meditative quality to it. You sit 30 miles in a trail, or in a saddle on a trail you've been on 100 times, and you see it differently every time. I mean, sort of like Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher, said you can't ever step in the same river twice. Well, you can't ever go on the same pack trip twice either. You can't really ever do anything twice. It's the same. And I think that ultimately, mules in particular have played this pivotal role for me in what it means to be human and to be involved in a change, transformation, intentional transformation process, just because they are just these incredible creatures that are reflecting back everything to me, about where I'm at, about what's going on with me, about what my desires are. And, for me, what I've always considered them for myself is there a certain kind of midwife that's delivering me back to my roots, or back to a more basic experience of myself, that I think, I hesitate to use the word pure a little bit, but there is a more fundamental experience of what it means to be human that I think is more primal. And I think that in large part, we have sort of like collectively been involved in a process of covering that all up through, building vehicles and development of culture and having grid systems and streets and running down the road at 70 miles an hour. And all that stuff I think is in a lot of ways counter to how we have evolved as humans. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the reasons I spend so much time in the wilderness is because it's actually a return to a more basic experience of the world around us. And that puts us in a more basic experience of ourselves. And the equines, I think, are a certain kind of bridge to that more fundamental experience of the world. And so, yeah, at least for me, they've certainly been that kind of a midwife. And in a lot of ways, I guess I can boil that down to, if Buddhism isn't about anything, it's about change. Mm-hmm. Just change. Everything around us is in a constant state of change. Nothing is fixed. Yep. Nothing is unchanging. And so when I go into the wilderness, the change process is absolutely undeniable. It's all around us. You see the rivers changing, the leaves changing. Every time I go there, it's changing. The fires are changing it. Everything is changing. And it's this untrammeled, relatively untouched blocks of land that I can go into and have a deep and intimate experience of change. And I think ultimately for me, where that's led me is seeing that change process, seeing the myriad of influences involved in that change process has allowed me to see that actually I'm involved in an interconnected web of experience. And at the end of the day, the ethical ramifications of that are, if you act any other way but selflessly, you end up acting self-destructively. And so being woven into this web has really been the final outcome, if you will, or the final process for me of being in the wilderness with these animals has really, really, in a way, given birth to me back into something that's more fundamentally human, something that's more primal. And really that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. It's really not to make money. It's not to move heavy things. It's not for Instagram. It's not for any of that stuff. Really what it's about is like this deeper interconnection. And then there's a sort of secondary dimension to it, which is having the ability to introduce other people to that process, whether they understand it or not, and watching people get affected by that. And especially in these times where it just seems like there's so much polarization in the world, politically, mm-hmm. socially. And, I think so much of that is actually artificial. I don't think we're actually as divided as it all sort of looks.
I agree.
I take people from the far right, and that's good. I take people from the far right into the wilderness, and I take people from the far left into the wilderness, and you take them off the top of the food chain, and there are grizzly bears out there that will eat you. And that changes the way people look at the world. It changes how people interact with each other. So I'm sitting out there with a hardcore Republican, and right next to me is a hardcore Democrat, and you would never know the difference. They love it out there. They love what they're seeing. They want to preserve it. The way they relate to each other is totally different. Once you pull away all the infrastructure of what it means to be living in an industrialized world, and it brings out a more fundamental aspect of people. And I think people do just ultimately want to connect. And I think we've just spent so much time historically covering that all up that, that we are in a lot of ways alienated from ourselves and alienated from one another. I think that's just manifest in all these divisions that we think are out there.
I completely agree with all that. And I think that's one of the reasons I love, expeditions or long trips in the mountains or hard days in the mountains with a team, is because it strips away all that nonsense. And, you've got this common purpose that you're going after, and none of that stuff matters. And then I've found the only downside is that when you get back from a trip like that and you're introduced to all the kind of bullshit of daily life, it kind of gets me down, because I'm like, man, it's, everything seems so important when you're out there in this life. The goal of the day is don't die. And then you come back and you're having to play around on email and, pay your cell phone bill and that kind of stuff. And I don't know, that's where I need to do better with the meditation, because it helps me deal with that kind of stuff. One more question about meditation real quick. If you had, in all your studies, you've obviously, know a ton more about it than I do. I'm a daily meditator as well, and it's the most important thing I've ever done, ever. But if you had to recommend 2 or 3 books for somebody that wanted to get started in meditation, doesn't know anything about it, what are there a few books you would recommend that would help people kind of dip their toe in it and start figuring it out? I apologize, I'm not going to remember it off the top of my head, but there's a great introduction to meditation book that, actually got me started. But I apologize, I'm not going to remember the name of that. That's all right.
I can't remember the author of it, but but I would certainly, honestly, I think, my take on it, honestly, though, is I would go learn from somebody. That's what I would go do. There's so much Buddhism out there. There's so many Buddhist centers out there. And I think books are great. I love books, big time reader, but I think meditation, historically, it's always been something that's needed to be communicated directly from one person to another. So if people are interested in meditation, that would certainly be my go-to thing, would be to go to a Buddhist center. You don't have to get affiliated. You don't have to quote unquote join or any of that. Just show up there, take an introduction to meditation class, take a few introduction to meditation classes, and see what sticks.
I agree. That's what I did. I lived in Boulder for a long time, and I went to the Shambhala Center to learn. Yeah. And I'll tell you, I mean, I'm from North Carolina. I'm not really into a bunch of kind of crazy stuff, and I didn't know what to expect, but there was no weird stuff, no like pitch for me to join up, no ask for money. Yeah. It was the most straightforward, cool thing. And it's like almost like going to a personal trainer for your brain, and they teach you the meditation, and then, if you want to keep coming back, you can. And it was the least weird experience, kind of with a religious institution I've ever been to.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah, there's some great stuff happening down in that area. I know Reginald Ray is an amazing teacher who I've had a bunch of interactions with, and I know that those guys have a great center going down in Boulder as well. And there's a lot of good stuff out there for sure.
Yeah, I can't recommend it enough. I mean, it is, and several people on this podcast have talked about how it's been so important to their lives, whether they're doing creative work or anything. And it's just, it's amazing stuff. So, we need to get to the mule packing, because otherwise we're going to be sitting here talking for like 5 hours, which would be fine with me. But so how did you? So you told a little bit about your first experiences, but how did you take it from kind of the first stage of being interested to being able to do this on a professional basis? How did you make that leap?
So, it was definitely a process. There's no question. It takes years. I mean, honestly, the first thing about it is, like, the amount of infrastructure you have to support even a small string is pretty significant. It's like, you got to have the land to keep them. You got to have the money to be able to feed them. Then you got to have a trailer to be able to move them from point A to point B. You got to have a truck that can safely pull that trailer from point A to point B. Then you got to have all the tack and the saddles and all that stuff. So, the infrastructure piece of it definitely took me quite some time to sort of build up. And, it is a process of doing that. So every year getting more equipment, getting more checked out with my stock. But really, I'm completely self-taught, which I would absolutely not recommend to anyone. Take a pack clinic. Because you're risking your life and you're risking the lives of your animals when you do that. And honestly, I had some early in my packing career, I had some bad wrecks, and I almost killed a couple of horses on a couple of different occasions. And thankfully that never happened. But
can you tell one of those stories, like what caused it?
Sure. Yeah. Inexperience is what caused it. It was completely my fault, but sure. I can remember going on a pack trip into the Bob, and I was, this was early in my packing career before I really got into mules. And so, had a few horses, and most of the horses that my wife at the time and I had were, really nice, like dressage horses. And, plus I had one, sort of like, grade quarter horse. And one of those, horses that was so nice, I was packing that horse, and, honestly, it's like, he didn't belong in the mountains. Those animals, their temperament, they're made for running at full out and taking big jumps and all the rest of it. They're not made for going into the wilderness. They just don't have the temperament that you need. And he was really spooky and sketchy. And, so I loaded him up and didn't know what I was doing, and had packed a bunch, but it was like the loads were too heavy. My loads were set too high on the saddle, which gives them a lot of lateral movement. But we were going up the first pass. We were like 3 miles in, and I saw that his pack was starting to roll. His saddle was starting to go. So I immediately stopped. And as I was getting off the horse, he saw that load shifting. He immediately just reared all the way up, went over backwards, landed on his back, and then proceeded to roll down a hillside fairly violently until he got wedged into a stand of quaking aspens, and he was sort of wedged in there, and all this gear sort of yard sailed out down the hillside. It was just strewn all over the place, and I jumped off my horse and went scrambling down there, and his breast collar was completely choking him out, and his eyes started rolling back into his head. And then, what can happen sometimes, they get, with horses and mules, if they get in too bad of a situation like that, they'll start going into shock, and they can die of a heart attack right on the spot. So I immediately pulled out my knife and started cutting leather as fast as I could to get that breast collar off. He was still flailing his legs, and, he's a big draft cross sport horse, stood about 16'1" or so, and weighed in at about 1,300 pounds. He's a big boy. Damn. And his feet are just flailing all over the place. And I cut that breast collar off, and then I started trying to get him to get up, started pulling the saddle apart. And he just, in the middle of all that, he just completely gave up and just froze, and his eyes rolled into the back of his head. And it was like, man, I did not know what to do. And I was pulling on his lead rope as hard as I could, and he just didn't even budge. And I honestly, I just didn't even know what to do. And it just out of the blue, it just dawned on me that I better start kicking him. And I'm someone who doesn't hit and doesn't kick animals, but this felt like it was a matter of life and death for him. And I just kicked him as hard as I could in the rib cage. And I kicked him as hard as I possibly could. And his eyes popped open. And he just bounded up and just about trampled me in the process. And it was definitely super scary, and he was shaking like a leaf, and he was just completely freaked out. And so, I led him back up the hill. Hour and a half later, I had the loads put back together, and I thought, oh man, they are just so scary. And got him on the trail and got over that path and got about half a mile down the other side where it's even steeper, and a pack string is coming up, and they're longer, had more pack animals than I did. So they had the right of way, and I tried to get off the trail out of their way. And without even that saddle rolling, he just flipped right over backwards. He just, the exact same thing, went charging down the hillside and just did it all over again. And it was one of not the worst day I've ever had packing, but certainly one of them. And, so, thankfully he didn't go into shock like that, but I eventually got him up, and probably solid 2 hours later, we were back on the trail, and, made camp instead of like the, whatever, almost 28 miles I would plan to go. I think we went 6 or something like that, and that was it. They camp, and then he didn't pack anymore. He never packed again, and then I rode him and packed my quarter horse. He did great for the rest of the trip, but I basically came back from that trip, and that was it for me with horses and packing. Like I have horses that all my horses can pack, but I don't pack them unless I absolutely have to. And yeah, I came home and started buying mules right there on the spot.
Well, yeah, well, that's a good way to start talking about the mule specifically. So for people who don't know, and I bet a lot of people don't, can you describe exactly what a mule is?
Sure. A mule is the offspring between a female horse, a mare, and a male donkey. It doesn't work the other way. Those are a totally different kind of animal called a hiney, and they only happen pretty much by mistake. They are not untrainable completely, but they're very rare and you don't see them, and they usually happen by accident because they do not contain the same qualities that a mule does at all. And they look quite a bit different too. So mules are a hybrid between a female horse and a male donkey. And the mules that I have all come out of large draft horse mothers. So a big draft horse mare, and then what's called a mammoth jack, which is a very, very large donkey. That is, they can be, 15.2, 15.3. They can be enormous. People don't realize how big some donkey breeds are, and these mammoth jacks are giant. So that's why, I don't have a single mule that weighs less than 1,200 pounds. They're all big, drafty mules. And so yeah, that's the sort of where they come from or what they are. But then they have a lot of different sort of traits about them that make them essentially generally speaking, they're superior pack animals. The first thing is their eyes are set a little bit wider on their head, so they do have better peripheral vision. They can see better, which is why people talk about them as being more sure-footed. Usually it's a matter that they can actually see better. The way that they carry loads is different. They have a much flatter back. So generally speaking, the loads will not shift as much as they walk down the trail. There's less overall lateral movement in their backs. They do have an amazing kind of hybrid vitality. So they are less susceptible to all sorts of different ailments because of that hybrid vitality. They don't get as sick as often. They tend to have less problems with colic. They tend to be able to eat less and maintain their weight. They can work longer. They have longer lives. They can work. It's not uncommon to see mules working pretty far into their 20s. They do live longer. They're sort of just overall significantly hardier animals. Their circulation system works slightly differently than horses. So they actually are able to cool themselves better. They do much better in hot weather, which is why places like for example, in New Orleans, where they have these mule-drawn carriages, they have outlawed horse-drawn carriages because of the heat. It's just too hard on horses, but mules, it does not affect them in the same way. So yeah, that, and then probably one of the big things is the way their fight or flight or freeze response works is just different than horses. Donkeys tend to have a little bit more fight in them than horses do. And so mules have sort of picked up that response to stressful situations. So, for example, in like minor situations where dogs like come up, like oftentimes horses will their initial response is to flee, but most mules will actually they'll try and kill the dog, just like a donkey would, generally speaking. But then also in packing situations, the big thing, they have this freeze response. So, you get a horse into trouble, which I've done more than my fair share of times, and they will panic. They will panic, and if they're caught in wire or they're caught in rope, they will panic and make things worse. A mule will actually not do that. Generally speaking, on the whole, they will wait for help. So I have mules get wrapped around a tree. I had a mule get a lead rope completely wrapped around his leg on the top of up at this lookout nearby, and he realized that's what happened, and he just laid down right in the middle of the trail and just calmly waited for me to completely unwrap him and untangle him from the sea of ropes. So that also makes them, very, very beneficial in the mountains, especially when you have, when you have a longer string, all of that starts to make, much more significant difference because things can go south so quickly, so fast, and there's so much rope involved, and there's so many animals involved that you need them to be able to sort of maintain some semblance of calmness in a panicky situation.
That's really interesting.
So, I think those are kind of the main things.
And so there's this cliche out there, stubborn as a mule. But in my reading about the animal, it sounds like that's not completely accurate. If they are stubborn, it's because they're extremely smart. And can you talk a little bit about their intelligence? And then I read also that they can. It sounds like they can almost be like a dog as far as being brave and protective of their owner. Is that true?
Yeah, they definitely can be like that for sure. But yeah, I think that the reason that they do have, I think that there's this cliche about them being stubborn really is because they are more intelligent. So a lot of that research now has been done, and just in the last 10 years, there's been a bunch of university studies that have shown through all these different problem solving techniques and whatever tests that mules are quite a bit more intelligent. So what that really means is, at the end of the day, is these mules if they say no, it's for a reason. And I'm not saying it's a good reason, but it's for a reason. They are not going to do something because it doesn't feel right. It doesn't look safe. It doesn't feel safe. Whereas, quite frankly, like with my lead string horse, I could pretty much convince him to do anything. I truly feel like if I asked, I could ride him off a cliff and he would listen to me and he would comply with what I tell him to do. Mules are not like that. Mules have a much stronger sort of self-preservation sense about them. And as a result, the way I always put it is, if you're working with mules, you're having a conversation. You can tell a horse what to do. You need to ask a mule to do something for you. Mm-hmm. And they will. I can ask my mules and have asked my mules to do things that they have no business doing. And we've gotten into trouble. But every time that's happened, they've always told me first, this is not a good decision. You're not making good choices right now. And I've certainly learned to listen to that, over the years, more and more, for sure. But they're very intelligent animals. And yeah, if they tell me they're not going somewhere, it's for a good reason, for sure.
When you select a new mule, when you're out looking for one, are there any specific characteristics you're looking for, or maybe characteristics that if you see, you're like, I don't want anything to do with that one?
Yeah. So the biggest thing for me is there's really, temperament. That's what matters to me more than anything. So I pretty much only run draft cross mules. That's it. They hold up better. They do better doing what I do. And if I had for a while I ran a smaller mule, and that poor little girl just couldn't keep up with these big guys. So the first thing, I wouldn't even look at a mule that wasn't a big drafty one to fit into my string. But then when it actually comes to the animal itself, conformation means almost nothing to me. Almost zero. Unless the thing is just completely a train wreck, like it's got a club foot or some total defect, I don't care what they look like. I don't care if they have withers. I don't care how high, how long their neck is, or if their neck's set on too low or too high. That's irrelevant to me. I want an animal with heart, and I want an animal that has a solid temperament. So, I used a lot of my mules came from this one outfitter, K-Lazy 3, when he was all geared up and selling. He was running 60, 70 mules, and most all of them were for sale at any given point. So when I would buy mules from him, it was, I would literally walk into a corral that was like 40 by 40 that had 40 head in it. And there's just so many animals crammed into this wilderness corral. And I just walk in there and just walk amongst them. And, honestly, the way I always put it is I would let the mule choose me much more than I would ever choose the mule. I want one that's curious, one that's going to come up to me, approach me, one that's going to actually try and connect with me. If the thing won't get near me and it's just running away constantly from me, like I just am personally not interested in that mule. They won't fit into the program that I have going, because I need animals that can connect. I need animals that are going to be good with people. I work around a lot of trail crews, and my animals are around a lot of people, and I can't have animals that are not going to get along with people or don't like people. I need to have animals that kids can run past and all that, because that's just part of the life on the trail. But more than anything, I need an animal with heart. It's got to be able to connect, and it's got to have heart. It's got to be willing to have a job that it loves to do. My animals enjoy their work. They do not it's not like I got to go chase them around the pasture in order to get them loaded up. That trailer comes out and they're ready to go and they know their job. And, yeah.
In some of the reading I was doing about you before we were chatting, there was I found an article somewhere, and you were talking about the idea of trying to control this huge operation you have going, all these animals, all these ropes, just there's so many moving parts, and so many moving parts,
right.
moving personalities, everything. And you mentioned in this article that you had come to a realization at some point that it's impossible to control it all. And so you just kind of need to let go and trust the animals. And then hearing about your Buddhism and your understanding about everything is in constant change. It all seems to kind of link together. Can you talk a little bit about that, about how you just kind of need to surrender control to the animals?
Yeah, you definitely do. I mean, it's just, I go out with so many heads, at a time that, in a way, it just has to be that way. It's like, I cannot control every facet of the experience for sure. And, I think probably the best way to illustrate it for me is, I was helping out this outfitter a number of years ago, and he had a really inexperienced packer. I finally got him into the backcountry with his string. And the next day I had to help him make this camp, and then I had to go, and I didn't get on the trail until way later than I should have to go back to the trailhead. And, it was in July, and I think I probably had 8 miles left, and it was about maybe 10:30 or 11, and it was starting to get dark. And I had maybe 2 loaded animals. The rest were empty. And, I'm riding along and it's getting pitch black, and, it's very dangerous packing in the dark. There's so many things that can go wrong and you just can't see well enough. And, I remember sitting there riding along and it's getting darker and darker, and I'm thinking, crap, and so the first instinct I had is like break out my headlamp, and whatever. And, and the headlamp just sort of creates so many problems. It's like, it's messing with their night vision because equines can see quite well, actually, especially if there's star or moonlight out. And eventually it was like, I was just so, kind of like worried about everything. And when I get worried like that, it just sort of ripples through the whole string, and everyone's kind of on edge. And so again, that constant feedback loop where it's just like, yeah, my emotional experience is having an effect on these animals by how I'm sort of like manifesting that in my body. So, I just turned the light off. It's like they'd been on that trail. Like they'd been on it 100 times. They knew where they were going. I didn't need to direct this whole thing. I didn't need to be in charge or control this whole thing. And I just hooked my reins around the horn and just held onto the lead rope of my lead mule. We just charged down the trail in pitch black, and I couldn't see a thing. And you just have this feeling of just like, that was one of the biggest learning lessons I think ever for me, which is just that, I'm not nearly in control of this whole thing as I think I am. And that I do just need to just let go and trust these animals. They trust me. So, I can certainly have that level of trust with them. And we just went right down that trail. We didn't have a single incident that whole 8 miles in the pitch black. And so I don't know, that was certainly a big turning point for me around what it means to trust them in that way. And now it's like all I can really do is there's certain things I can control, how my loads are set, how much they weigh, how everybody is saddled, making sure the cinches are all good, making sure the ropes are all put up properly. But beyond that, it's like they know what they're doing. I know what I'm doing. And I just have to let go of that and just let them go where they need to go. And there's minor directions that I give them on the trail, but I don't ride with bits. I don't think I need to. These animals know what they're doing. They don't have to have that level of control, or they don't need that level of me controlling them. They just need reminders at certain trail junctions. Hey, are we going left or are we going right? Because sometimes we go one way, other times we go the other way. So they need cues for where we're going. And then, they'll need cues for when we're going to stop and go. And that's really about it. They don't need this big array of vocabulary in terms of cues for what we're doing. So I think that whole process has certainly been very interesting, and has all sorts of like ramifications for the rest of my life in terms of knowing when to let go and knowing when to engage in a way that's directive like that.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, is that those lessons, you could apply those to your experience in mountaineering, or your experience in the Marines. It's just this crazy environment where there's so much going on. And if I think most normal humans would try to think they could control it, but that's just a recipe for driving yourself nuts. I would imagine. I mean, obviously haven't been in the Marines, but I've done some mountaineering, and you just got to take care of what you can take care of, and then just kind of let go. It's a tough thing to do.
Yeah, that's very true. It is. And, and I was lucky enough last year, to be able to take Conrad Anchor on a pack trip in the Bob.
Oh,
which
really?
Was an incredibly meaningful thing to me. Yeah. To be able to meet my hero. Like, people always say, don't meet your heroes. I could not prescribe that strongly enough. Go meet your heroes, go find them. And, and I was able to bring him into the Bob with his amazing wife, Jenny Lowe Anchor.
Yep.
And it was there was so much overlap in the way that he saw this entire program with how I understand how wilderness works and how control works. And what does it mean to be in this environment and not have the control that you think you do, and to listen to him talk about the enormous array of people that he's lost to mountaineering, and just how he's managed that with such incredible grace. It was incredibly inspiring, but there is a big overlap between all the, being in the wilderness, whether you're hiking or packing or mountaineering. There's a big overlap there, and how people approach it and the impact it has on their lives.
That's really cool. You got to spend time with him. He's a hero of mine as well. And he,
oh, is he? Yeah.
Yeah. The tragedy that guy's had to endure is just amazing. But both, you were talking about Alex Lowe as well. And, I think both of those guys, the thing that sticks out to me is they're obviously energetic and brave and that kind of thing. But they were, Alex was, and Conrad still is, just amazingly positive and optimistic, in the face of, surviving some, pretty just terrible tragedies. It's a real, I love anything I can get my eyes on that Conrad has done, the movie Maru, and just following on Instagram. It's very inspiring.
So amazing.
That's cool.
Yeah, it really is. He's incredibly inspiring, and I felt incredibly lucky to do that. And he wants to do a couple work trips, or at least a work trip with me this summer. And he is such an amazing and inspiring individual on so many levels, and so accessible. And just, my God, that guy's heart is just, it's bigger than my mule's heart. It's just huge. He's just such a fine human being, and could not speak more highly of that guy. That's for sure. And his wife is incredible. Jenny's amazing.
Isn't that cool when you meet somebody that you have had admired from afar, and they're just as cool or cooler than you expected? It's refreshing.
It is. It's amazing. Yeah, it really is. When your expectations, they don't just get exceeded, they got blown out of the water. And I look like he wanted to do some rock climbing, but while we were back there. So he brought a little rack, and I had obviously done some rock climbing when I was younger. And, he just set up a top rope on this big boulder that had fallen off of the sort of southern end of the Chinese wall, and in the Bob. And he set up this top rope, and he wanted to be belayed too. And this is we're talking like 30 feet or something of climbing, and the level of enthusiasm and excitement that this guy had when he hit that rock. And this guy's climbed all over the world. He's summited Everest multiple times. He's been to like every amazing wilderness, on the planet. And here this guy is, just this simple climb. And he was so fulfilled and so tuned into it and so enthusiastic about this tiny climb. It's like, just to be around that kind of energy where someone is that passionate, that despite how many times he's done this, despite, he's one of the top climbers in the world, here he is on a nothing, just this little boulder. And he is so tuned into that rock, and he is just having the time of his life. And that was just such a huge message for me. And I try and think about that a lot. Like, hey, it's there's some little kid, some folks that live, my neighbors, they have a little kid that's horse crazy. It's like, I come on up, and I just want to engage with this little girl walking around as I lead her. I want to engage with that, just like Conrad engaged with that rock. Like, hey, this is just as important, in some ways, maybe more important.
It's contagious.
What I'm doing writ large. Yeah, it really is. So I'm grateful for him, for sure.
That's great to hear. One time in North Carolina, before I moved out west, I went and saw him speak at a North Face event, and and they had a raffle and they gave away a backpack and I won the backpack and he gave it to me. So I can say I've met him. He definitely doesn't remember it, but I still use that backpack. So, he's a cool guy. And it makes me happy to hear that, he blew the expectations out of the water. One more,
really did.
You were just talking about his heart, and that reminded me of your brand, the Heart W. Can you explain the meaning behind that brand?
Sure. Yeah. So Heart W, it comes back to sort of like this broader sort of, I guess maybe the broader philosophy of what I'm doing or the broader meaning of what I'm doing with my pack trips. But yeah, as I said, I feel like in a lot of ways, these mules have been these midwives that have delivered me back into something more primal, something more untrammeled, something more sort of like connected to the evolution of what it means to be human. And so for me, it's what that really means is I go into the heart of the wilderness, but the flip side of that is these mules are delivering me into the wilderness of my own heart. So there's this untrammeled, untracked heart of myself that that I feel like in a lot of ways I've been alienated from, and it's getting me back to that. It's reconnecting me with the deepest parts of myself. And that's really what I'm most interested in doing in the end. And this whole process is part of that. And the Heart W definitely is a representation for me of what that means. And all my animals wear that brand, and it's super meaningful to me for sure.
Do you have the brand on yourself?
I do. Yeah. Yep. I do. I definitely people branding, the Instagram community is full of so many different fascinating and amazing people. But yeah, I've definitely gotten, over the years, I've certainly gotten a lot of grief about a lot of different aspects of it from, aspects of what I do. So whether it's, people from certain animal rights organizations feel that like what I'm doing is cruel and inhumane. But definitely there was, I just had, when I got one of the mules I got, and I showed some images of it getting branded. And wow, it was unbelievable. The response that came back to me was vitriolic, and I just it definitely just made me think quite seriously about. I didn't immediately just think they were just off their rocker. It did make me think about is this cruel to them, and is this unkind to them, and I thought, well, shoot, I've put them all through this process. I don't think it's cruel. It's an important facet because my stock free ranges in the backcountry, and there is, stealing stock is a real thing still in Montana. Rustling still happens. Yep. And the reason to wear brands is because I don't want to lose them, and you can't, I want them to have these registered brands, all of them. So I just thought, well, screw it. If they did it, I can do it. So
That's awesome.
I got branded.
That's really cool, and that's hard to argue with.
Yeah.
Well, man, we have been talking for an hour, and I'm looking at my list. Yeah, and I think I've asked you like 5 questions that I wanted to get through. I've got we're gonna have to do part 2. I'm gonna hassle you for that because there's so much more I want to talk about. But I've got some kind of quick questions that I go through with everybody. If you have time to run through those real quick.
Good. Yeah.
Cool. Do it. So what, if you had to pick 1 or 2, what are your favorite books about the American West?
Blood Meridian, point, end of story.
Really?
The best book about the American West. Yep.
You're the first person to mention that, which is crazy.
Are you?
Yeah.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, Cormac McCarthy is by far my all-time favorite author, and that book, Blood Meridian, absolutely has blown my mind. I've probably read it 16 or 17 times. I still don't fully understand it. Every time I read it, I get something else out of it. Incredibly meaningful book. Not always super accessible, but I think that's by design. And again, one of those things that I'm quite happy never to resolve. I'm quite happy to hold these two things, not the lack of understanding and the desire to totally understand it. I'm happy to hold those two things, equally. But that book has informed a huge amount of my own experience for sure.
I misspoke. I thought you said One Meridian, and I was like, I've never heard of that. What book is that?
Meridian.
Blood Meridian.
Oh, no,
yeah,
Blood
and that has come up, and it's come up by a lot of artistic-minded people, and I've got it sitting here on my shelf right now, and I need to make myself read it. I will. I'm gonna do it. Do you have any other favorite books, not about the West, but just favorite books in general?
Pretty much anything by Cormac McCarthy. I think he sort of like wrecked. He sort of ruined fiction for me in a way. After I got involved in reading his books, it was just everything just felt like such a letdown to me after reading that. So which is, it's short-sighted on my part for sure, but anything by Cormac McCarthy. I know I just recently reread Sutri, and you really like that book a lot. And I think there's so many interesting facets to that. But I think anything by him. But recently, I guess I could also say like recently. I don't mean it like it's something that I would take to my grave or anything. But I recently read a book by Peter Stark called Astoria, which was a great read about the American West.
I love that
settling
book.
Of the American West. I found that really, really good book.
Yeah, I love that. And I was thinking about that book yesterday because I put a picture on Instagram of a trip I did back in college in the Pacific Northwest where it was raining. It rained for like 3 weeks straight and it was cold. And I was thinking, I'm wearing all this fancy gear and I about got trench foot and it was just a really rough time. And those people in that book, Astoria, they were wearing cotton and wool and leather. I mean, I don't know how they did it. I don't know how they did it.
I don't either. I still don't get it. And I've been to Astoria, and holy cow, the water coming out of the sky is no joke over there for sure.
Yeah, that's some real tough stuff there. Do you have any favorite documentaries?
Meru.
Yeah, so good.
Amazing, so inspiring. I think other than that, there is another. There's a PBS documentary out there called 3 Miles an Hour, which is kind of a relatively low budget. I think it's well done, but relatively low budget documentary about, in particular, about one really well known packer named Smoke Elser here in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, and he's done some amazing things for packing, certainly for promoting packing. He's been doing it for so long, and it really delves into the history of the Bob Marshall Wilderness and the Wilderness Act and how that all sort of came together. But I think as far as documentaries, Meru and 3 Miles an Hour. But I mean, Meru just like blew my mind. There's so much about that film.
Yeah, it's a masterpiece, and all those guys. Jimmy Chin he's just a fascinating story into himself, and it's God, what a well done film.
Yeah.
People if you don't like mountaineering, it doesn't matter because it's such a good film. Anybody would.
It does not matter. I agree. Yeah.
So at the beginning, you listed out about what I would consider to be about 6 different full-time jobs that you do. So what do you do for fun when you need to blow off steam? Do you ever just kind of sit around and do nothing?
Those things.
That's it.
Those are the things. That is what I do for fun. Yeah. No, I mean, honestly, the most fun things that I'm involved in are definitely anything, not even just packing, but anything that has to do with my equine. So right now I'm in the process of transitioning from one lead horse to another. And so I've got this mare who's going to be, this is her sort of like inaugural year as the lead horse. And so I've been working with her, pretty much every single day for, since the snow melted to really just get her tuned up. And we have a really big 32-day long project that we're going to be involved in for the entire month of July, moving about 16,000 pounds of bridge decking material to a backcountry bridge that's getting worked on. And so, I'm really trying to get her ready for that. It's kind of like my main focus, but I really enjoy that. Having had the chance to do, a saddle making apprenticeship with, to me, one of the best saddle makers out there was a huge opportunity for me that's been in the works for quite some time. And, making saddles is far more rewarding than I ever imagined. And definitely something I just absolutely love to do. So really anything that has to do directly with, my equines, I love to do it. And, and then building saddles really is just so fulfilling. So those two things I do find incredibly enjoyable. That is what I do. And I mean, in this lifestyle that I'm living, it's just so full on, it's my entire life revolves around these animals. I mean, I have my tack room saddle shop is right off my master bedroom from one door, and the other door from my master bedroom opens directly into the hay shed where I feed out. So it's just cool. These animals they are my life in so many ways.
Very cool. This is probably a hard question for you, but if you had to think of one single experience that would be the most powerful experience you ever had in the outdoors, and that could be scary, it could be funny, just a memorable experience? Is there any single experience that comes to mind that kind of has blown your mind?
Yeah, I probably have one scary, maybe one more inspiring. But yeah, I was in the Bob late in the fall. This is maybe 5 years ago now, and I was just bumping a load of hay into a backcountry cabin for the Forest Service, and it was in late October, and it rained the whole way in, and I was just going to stay one night, and I was with a young woman who I'd met from Instagram, and she just really wanted to get out there and see what this whole experience was like. So I let her tag along on this trip, and it had rained all night. It had definitely snowed at the pass. And I, genuinely was like, well, shoot, I didn't know if this was going to be a good move, but I was like, we can get up there and we can see if we can get out. It's a very, very, steep traverse that you have to do to get over this pass. It's straight up on the uphill side and straight down about 250, 300 feet on the downhill side. And it's basically the trail sort of carved out of a cliff. And I thought, well, it's not going to be a big deal because I have all the support from the Forest Service. So I can turn around, they can move my truck, I can go to a different trailhead or whatever. So we rode up there and, we got into the snow. There was 5 or 6 inches. It was fresh. The stock was breaking through it without a problem. I wasn't loaded. My stock was empty except for one load of my personal gear. So I thought, we're going to be fine. And it didn't look too bad at all. So I got up on the traverse and kind of came around this bend, and wow, it was the whole entire trail was completely drifted over. Oof. And you just couldn't see it from where I was down below. And, had I to do it over, I would have just tied everyone up and just hiked it and really just gotten a firsthand look at it and, been like, okay, this is going to be okay, or not. And I could have turned around and it was not okay. And I immediately stopped, got off. I had this young woman in front of me riding one of my other horses, and I just said, you just stay there. And the whole plan when you get in these situations is you have to, if you can't turn the whole string around tied, you basically go to the back of the string and you turn each animal around one at a time, and then you lead them back out. Uh-huh. And I couldn't even get to the back of the string. There was so much ice and so much snow, and I just did not. I was just like immediately was like, oh my God, this is going to be, I just resigned myself. There's no way I'm going to get out of this without losing an animal over the edge because there's so much ice and the snow has drifted to almost 4 feet over the trail.
Wow.
And it was just this weird sort of thing where it was like, I don't know, in a way, maybe it reminded me a teeny bit, my own private version of that film, Touching the Void, where it's like, the only way out is through it. Uh-huh. And I thought, oh man, I was so freaked out. And so, honestly, we just charged ahead and just totally went for it. I could not ride, had to walk. And this poor girl in front of me was walking and the horses were bounding to get through the snow. And there's all this ice on the rock underneath. And there were so many times where they slipped off the trail and barely recovered and were hanging with legs over the cliff, and then they scrambled back up, and she almost got run over a few different times. And and the wind was absolutely howling. And wow, never was I so happy as when I got to the top of that pass. I was shaking. She was shaking. She was crying. It was scary. And the wind was every bit of 40 miles an hour, and it was just blowing snow. And I just never forget looking back at all those animals. And there is video footage of that actually on Instagram somewhere in there. But
oh, really?
But my animals were so calm. Yeah, there is. Yeah, when I got to the top, I looked back, and you can just see us as we crest onto the saddle, and it was it was just, that was the scariest thing I've ever done. And then I don't know, probably one of the more amazing experiences I've probably had is just, honestly, there's one place I go in the North Fork of the Sun River country, and there's just something about, having a nice early supper and, just kicking all the mules out and jumping on a horse bareback and just riding through these meadows, galloping through these meadows, and the sun's setting and the sky is, going from blue to amber to crimson to purple, and, just being out there and just really, really simple experience of just hanging out with a bunch of animals in the backcountry and just having this overwhelming sense that I don't understand everything that's happening in this world. I don't understand how it all works. I don't really need to. At the end of the day, I just know that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And I know I'm in this web of interconnection. And, just having a sense that everything's going to just work out.
That's a good feeling to have. I don't think many people have that. Yeah. That's really awesome. Yeah. And that brings me to my next question. If you had to pick one spot that's your favorite place in the West, can you name it, or would you be willing to name it? Because when I asked Ben Masters that, he said, "Yeah, I got one, but I'm not going to tell you."
Nah, I'm not that private about these places because honestly, it's like, as far as I'm concerned, like the more people that get back in there, the better. That's just I mean, hopefully these places don't get loved to death, but I don't think that's going to happen. I want people to get in there. I want people to explore the wilderness. It's theirs just as much as mine. I don't care if you live in New York City or Alaska or wherever. All these wilderness areas are ours, and they're to be experienced and protected by all of us. So no, honestly, I probably would just pick, I don't know, one or two places, either the North Fork of the Sun River or in the Bob. There's a place called Half Moon Park, which is that's where I took Conrad and Jenny, and just a large, big chunk of the Chinese Wall, the southern end of it. And yes, that is the Continental Divide. And there's something about that big rock face, and it sheds pretty frequently during the day. So it's like shedding these big boulders, and you can just see something that looks so static, and yet it's just moving and it's alive, and hearing those rocks just tumble off these cliffs and just land into these scree fields, and the mountain goats and the bears and everything in that area. It's a really special place. So yeah, Half Moon Park for sure. And then just the open meadow valley of the North Fork of the Sun River is really a remarkable piece of country for sure.
Very cool. I've never been to either of those places, so I need to get them on my list.
Put them on the list.
Yeah, definitely. So here's another one that's kind of tough, but I bet you'll have a good answer. What is the best piece of advice you've ever received, if you can think of one?
I would say, in the scene, only the scene, and in the herd, only the herd.
Very good.
That's probably the best of all that I've gotten. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really good.
And I mean, to me, it just speaks of this overall project that we have. Like my master's degree and my thesis and dissertation was really about Buddhist epistemology. So just theories of how we know what we think we know, especially as it relates to language. Like linguistic epistemology is really like, that's right in my lane. And what I'm most interested in, that's to say, how does language affect the way we experience the world, and adding thought into that as a linguistic function. So to me, I think we spend so much time falsely impregnating our perceptual flow. So we just have this array of information coming in to our body, and we spend so much time and so much energy falsely impregnating it, whether it's diminishing it, whether it's, exaggerating it, whether it's categorizing it, and all that stuff is necessary. That's how we navigate the world. But I think we take it all too seriously in an implicit way. And I think that saying from the Buddha is just a really powerful one, which is, in the scene, only the scene, and in the herd, only the herd. And I think that process of impregnation of our perceptual flow, what we're actually doing is we're alienating ourselves from the profound richness of what this world has to offer without all of that. We're so busy trying to add or take away from every experience that we just don't see that what a problem that actually is for us. And if you can let go of that process and just be with whatever it is that's in front of you, in the scene, only the scene, in the herd, only the herd, what unfolds is an experience that's significantly richer than this limited, way we have of managing our reality, managing our perception.
I agree with that. It's the kind of thing that I understand it completely in theory, and it's one of these things that's simple but not easy. I understand it, but it's so hard to really live it. Last big question. If you could make a request of the people that listen to this podcast, and it's just people that love the American West, whether they do it through outdoor sports or through art or conservation or ranching, the full spectrum. But if you could make a request to those people or offer some words of wisdom, is there anything that comes to mind?
I mean, I would honestly, just as maybe as cliche as it sounds, I would just say, get out there. This is everyone's wilderness, like I said, and just get out there. And maybe I would say, look at the difference between a wilderness area and just a standard national forest. There is a difference. There's a difference legally, politically, but it's a different experience. It's a different experience being in a wilderness area, being somewhere that's so primitive, that's so untrammeled, that's so unaffected and untouched, largely untouched by humans. It hasn't had this huge list of land management decisions made about it. The land management decision has been, let's leave it alone. Let's have some places that are left alone. And I would say go to those wilderness areas and see what comes up for you, both internally and externally.
I think that's great advice. I completely agree. So how can people connect with you online? Where should they look?
Just Instagram is great, at Mule Dragger. That's me. And, follow along on our little ridiculous journey.
You got a great Instagram, man. It's really resonated with people, obviously. So, I can't thank you enough for taking the time. And I'm serious, man. We need to do a part 2 because we only scratched the surface.
We did. More things. Yeah, I'd love to.
Cool. Well, I really appreciate your time, and I'll look forward to staying in touch. And thank you so much.
Sounds good. Yeah, we'll have to get you out on a pack trip one day.
Hell yeah, I'm in. Hey, this is Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast, and thanks for listening to that particular episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Before you go, I've got 3 quick things. Number 1, if you like the podcast, please do me a huge favor. Either pass it along to a friend who may be interested, share it on your social media, or go to iTunes and give it a 5-star review. All those things would mean a lot to me, and they would really help to spread the word about the podcast. Number 2, if you've listened to many of these episodes, you know that I love reading and I love talking about books. Every other month, I send out a quick email with a few books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The subjects are varied, but they're pretty much all nonfiction with an emphasis on history, biographies, adventure narratives, and topics related to the American West. There are no sales pitches for ranches, no spam, no other kind of nonsense, just books. So if you'd like to sign up for the list, head to Mountain and Prairie/reading, or just go to Mountain and Prairie and there's a massive tab at the top that says book recommendations. Click on it. There are a ton of good books that I've read. Some of the old email lists are on there. You can go crazy. There are a lot of books. And finally, if you know anyone I should interview for the podcast, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. All my contact info is at mountainandprairie.com, and I'm on all the social media stuff, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, blah, blah, blah. So feel free to reach out. I'd love to have some recommendations and suggestions of interesting people I should meet. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.